Hi, AP and CCP US history students. Today we're going to be talking about the pop culture of the antebellum America. So, how reformers and religious folks influenced American culture, influenced American society, and influenced American values. This is a change because prior to this, if you wanted to affect change in any capacity, you probably had to be part of the government. These are people that have indirect ties to the government, so certainly they have friends who are in the government or people that they know who are government officials, but are not they themselves part of the government institutions. So let's talk a little bit about these individuals. This one hopefully will be a little bit quicker than the other videos this week. So starting off, we're going to talk about reviving religion. If you remember, in the 1730s, we had the First Great Awakening. And the First Great Awakening was all about scaring the living bejesus out of people in New England and Pennsylvania, like kind of the mid-Atlantic, New York area. Now, years later, the religious fervor of the Great Awakening has died off. The American Revolution has occurred, and the Enlightenment thought has started to creep in. So you have kind of a rise in what is known as deism, which Jefferson and Franklin both believed in. This was the idea that there was an almighty being, that there was somebody in charge, but that there was no real specific religious dogma. And this is why people like Jefferson and Franklin would read the Bible, but they would also read the Quran. They would read Buddhist teachings. They would read all the different documents that they could get their hands on because they were searching for a bigger picture answer than just one specific religion. You also had the Unitarian Church form in New England that basically went against the mysticism of the Holy Trinity. Some churches, when you walk in, they are big on God being God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They didn't believe in that. They put it into one. They said there was one being. That's it. So if you talk about Jesus, you're talking about God on earth. If you're talking about his influence, that is God. There is no three parts of it. Okay. So again, the Unitarian Church is going to be very specific about, hey, this was just one being and one being alone. So that's certainly going against the Great Awakening teachings. So not surprisingly, when you swing back the other direction, you have the Second Great Awakening. Now, the Second Great Awakening occurs geographically a little different. It goes more towards Western Pennsylvania, Western New York, a place called the Burned Over District, in Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee. So we're talking about going out towards the frontier, even going into the South and ministering to slaves. That's kind of where this Great Awakening comes from. But this time, instead of it being, the Great Awakening of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, who basically tried to scare people, Jonathan Edwards saying that you were a spider over the pit of hell and that God can drop you into the fiery, the flames for all eternity if you don't repent. These guys are going to be a little bit more light. The Methodists are coming in, the Baptists are coming in during this time period, and these are new sects of Christianity. These are new kind of groups, if you will, that are splitting off and splintering from previous groups. And these groups are very much into the Methodists, and even by their name, the method, how you actually go about worshiping, how you sing, how you preach, how you carry yourselves on a day-to-day basis. Baptists, very big into traditions, very big into ceremonies, big into like the idea that you have to be baptized in order to go to the kingdom of heaven, that you have to do communion, you have to do certain things within your religious observances. So again, these groups are going to be very much into the process of it. So not surprising, if you go to a Methodist or Baptist church, you're probably very used to certain processes. You're used to the fact that, I grew up Methodist. I was used to the fact that at least once a month we were going to have communion. There was probably going to be a celebration of life ceremony where we were baptizing somebody at least once a month. There was probably going to be some celebration of, somebody being confirmed and brought into the church. New members were celebrated. There's a method, there's a process, there's a schedule to everything. Baptists, kind of the same deal. They were born out of the same cloth, if you will. So the Second Great Awakening is very much into that, but they're also very much into the idea of being a softer version of religion. These are not, the preachers like Charles Grandison Finney, they're not out to threaten anybody. They're not trying to scare people into the pulpit, or into the pews, I should say. they're trying to celebrate. They're trying to bring people out and get them excited and excite the spirit, if you will. And they had a very specific way of going about it. They realized that their softer touch, so to speak, was going to appeal to females more. So even Grandison Finney kind of embraces that. And at his tent meetings, as they were known, at his big festivals, because he'd show up in a community to preach, and he would basically set up a huge tent outside of town, bring loads of people in. They would spend the weekend preaching and conversing and, singing and dancing and whatever else. When they would celebrate these weekends, he would put women in the front row, and he called it the anxious bench. And these women were people that were not converted yet per se. They were not members of the local church. These were people that were curious. They weren't quite 100% sold on this. So he would kind of preach to them specifically. Now, by doing so, these women would, maybe be converted during the weekend, and then the next week start bringing in their family, bring the kids with them, bring the husband. And so you start seeing not only a feminization of religion where things get a little softer and a little bit calmer and a little bit more celebratory, and appealing to the emotional side of Jesus, the emotional side of the church. They also realized that they were spreading the good news through the women, that the women were making the choice in the household, which is going to have major ramifications because women are going to start taking more of a leading role in the household. So there's going to be some further, effect or impact of this religious awakening on women awakening to the idea that they have social importance and then down the line, political importance as well. Now, denominations start to diversify a little bit. You start to get kind of wacky ones out there, the Millerites and the Adventists. These were people that decided that the world was going to end in, I think, October of 1842. They kind of read the Bible and said, well, the apocalypse based upon what we have observed is coming in 1842. They, basically told everybody to repent and be ready for the second coming, and nothing happened. And of course, they, most people would look at that and be like, boy, that's really embarrassing. The Millerites were like, we did our math wrong. It'll be another time. We'll let you know. So again, like there are certain groups that kind of form, but it shows that the American people, even though these are kind of outside groups and what would be considered peripheral groups of the mainstream, it shows that the American people are still searching for bigger picture answers. They're not satisfied with just a simple answer to anything. They're willing to listen to whatever. So it does show a diversity of opinion. It shows a diversity of thought within the populace. And it does play into the fact that we are spreading out as a society because of manifest destiny, because of the addition of territories. We are seeing a widening of classes and a widening of regions. You're starting to see the South spread out. You're starting to see the North kind of morph into the Midwest. You're seeing the Midwest now going out West. So you're getting newer communities. You're kind of redoing everything. And you're seeing a rebirth of not only our culture, but our politics and even our religions. Now, the other thing is, too, you've got these new religious groups kind of spreading out, and their teachings are different based upon their regions. And it is no more so true than when they teach about slavery. If you are in, let's say, New York, and you're listening to a preacher like Henry Ward Beecher or one of the preachers in New York City or Brooklyn, they're preaching about how slavery is an evil. Not surprisingly, the Beecher family, who's going to produce Harriet Beecher Stowe. Lyman Beecher is a huge preacher during this time period. That's Harriet Beecher Stowe's father. Lyman Beecher, who comes out to Cincinnati and goes into Indiana and preaches, he's very much against slavery. He's preaching that it is an evil in the eyes of God. Well, the preachers down south are not saying the same thing. These preachers are saying that slavery is part of the Bible. Slavery is an institution that is okayed by God. And they're basing it off of Scripture. So the issue of slavery in the church is a big one because how the church handles this is going to have major impacts on regions and on the country as a whole. But needless to say, you also have other splinter groups that are even more out there. And I don't mean out there in a bad way, but just it's a bigger leap of faith than what the American people are used to. Joseph Smith, the man pictured here, is in the burned over district, what is known as the burned over district of New York. And this was an area that had been preached to. It had been swept through in the Second Great Awakening. And the people there were either swept up in it, or they were not convinced yet. Well, Joseph Smith has a revelation. He has basically a dream where he says the angel Gabriel comes down and shows him tablets, basically. And I could be saying this wrong. I'm doing the best I can with this, and I apologize if you or anybody you know is Mormon. I'm not really up to date on my Mormon faith and theology, but in a nutshell, basically the Joseph Smith basically says, this angel of the Lord, Gabriel, comes down and has revealed to me these kind of almost kind of hieroglyphic tablets that he uses to kind of decipher a new book of the Bible, if you will. And he basically puts out a book called the Book of Mormon that is the founding document of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, better known as the Mormons. Now, when he comes out with this, there are a ton of people that say that is complete and utter ridiculousness. How dare you? You're claiming that you're some sort of modern day prophet. And look, Smith is not exactly accepted by the vast majority of the Americans, especially in upstate New York, where he is at the time. So he kind of more moves west along with some of his followers, and he picks up people as he's going. He ends up getting on the wrong side of the wrong people, and he is murdered in Missouri. When this occurs, the Mormons are kind of stalled. They realize that they are not being accepted in mainstream American culture in the East or the Midwest. So they follow a guy named Brigham Young out to Utah, and they settle around the Salt Lake City region. They, of course, established Salt Lake City. They established their own church. The Mormons are still very much a powerhouse out in Utah. You know, the Mormon faith is that's where the stronghold is. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't Mormons around. There certainly are. There are churches of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Mormons are a growing entity. They are a worldwide religion too. They have spread throughout the world. But Brigham Young's escape out to Utah basically isn't exactly an escape completely. They have problems with the United States government, specifically Washington, D.C., does not accept Young, and they don't accept Utah as a state. They don't accept it because Young and his followers are in charge of it. And one of the key sticking points is that the Mormon faith allows for polygamy. It allows for multiple wives. The United States government basically says we're not following along with that. We're not allowing a state to come in with that as part of their law code. This was our first real fight over marriage and what marriage definition really is. Young makes the argument that, hey, there's nothing in the American Constitution that says we can't do this, and you are violating our free exercise of it if you deny us statehood based upon that. And they're going to fight about that for years. So it's not like the Mormon church had a very solid relationship with the United States government from the start. It is rocky at best, but it all starts with that. Now, again, why does that matter? The Mormons help us to expand west. By this push of this Mormon population out to Utah, it actually shows the way to get out west. It kind of paves the way for many people to not only go out to Utah, but to settle in places like Nevada and California and Oregon. So they do help with our push west. Okay. And of course, there's still a very large population out in Utah, even to this day. Many of you, especially football fans of college football, would know the University BYU, which is Brigham Young University out there. Again, you have to, that is a Mormon-based university. Okay, and it's a very conservative university as well. So they are holding on to their Mormon faith and their Mormon principles very much so out there. But again, this is all during this time period of the Great Awakening, where you see a diversity of religious belief structures being born and being cultivated during that time period. Now, of course, during this time period as well, you have some crusaders like Horace Mann, pictured here. The early schools in America were one-room schoolhouses where there was really no standard. There was no standards of practice, if you will, like, hey, these are the standards you have to cover in grade levels or whatever else. Early schools were, for lack of better terminology, just glorified tutoring more than anything else. And there were no standards for teachers either. Some of these teachers would proclaim that they were trained to do the job, but they really weren't. They were local hires. They were people that, knew enough to actually get by and teach students to whatever their level of schooling was themselves. So early schools were, kind of a disaster, if you will. Horace Mann is going to come in and say, not only do we need a public school, and public school is the idea that the local community is going to support a school, that they are going to support it financially, they're going to support it with resources, they're going to support it with, kind of some good faith from the community, if you will. And public schools start to increase during this time period because Horace Mann starts to say, not only do we need that, we need standards, we need trained teachers, we need them to be set up to where everybody going there from the community knows what type of education they're going to graduate with. And more importantly, that the public schools cannot be just based on local customs alone. So you can't just teach somebody in Iowa how to be a farmer and be satisfied with that. This is the birth of what it eventually becomes known as a liberal education. This idea that you learn multiple disciplines, that you learn math, you learn science, you learn literature, you learn how to read and write properly, grammar, you learn some social studies, so civics, you learn a little bit of everything. So even if you're not strong at something, you still have a basic knowledge of it before moving on. And you guys still are following that system that he set up because you're taking classes that you may not like. Some of you are sitting here going, I hate AP US history. I hate history in general. Why do I need to learn it? Well, you can thank Horace Mann for kind of pushing for that liberal education, saying you may not like it, but you have to know something about it. You can't just move into life without knowing the basics. And he was kind of pushing that more than anybody else. Noah Webster is going to come along and standardize the language through the use of a dictionary. Again, I've said this before, we do not speak English. We speak standard American English. Noah Webster was well aware that the Oxford English Dictionary did not cover the language that we spoke. We use words that England does not. England uses words that we never would. Okay, it's a bloody mess over there, as they would say. There are a million different words that we don't use. Not many of you are using the term bollocks. Like there are English words that are some of them not exactly a proper term by any stretch, but we don't use any of their slang. We don't use many of their proper terms either. So he decided to put together a dictionary of American terms, and so he standardized the American English. By doing so, we pretty much separate from England completely. We had separated from them politically, we had separated from them economically, socially. Now we're separating our language from them as well. And then in order to kind of push for that a little bit more, William McGuffey comes along and produces what are known as McGuffey readers. These are the first real reading textbooks. These are the ones that grade school students would use to try and learn the basics of grammar, the basics of reading, and reading comprehension. He has local ties as well because he was a part of Miami University. If you go to Miami University and you're an education major like I was, you go to school at McGuffey Hall, named after him. The McGuffey Museum is there, and you can see some of his original McGuffey readers, which were still widely utilized well into the 1900s, as my grandparents both had McGuffey readers when they went through school. So these are long-ranging, very important changes to the system of education. And of course, improving education happens throughout society to the point where they start realizing that they need universities. So no longer is it going to be okay to just go with Harvard, Yale, William and Mary, Brown, Princeton. The Ivy League schools that are out there are fine and everything, but they start realizing, we need higher level education throughout the United States. You can't just, send everybody from the United States to Harvard. That's a long trip, number one. And Harvard's not really equipped to have very large student bodies. So they start realizing that with improving education at the lower levels, you're going to have more universities at the higher levels. And it's a twofold process. One, you're going to have state-sponsored schools. So you're going to see North Carolina say, we put some tax money into our high schools. We put some tax money into our elementary schools. Now we're going to have to put some tax money into colleges. So you start seeing state-run schools like the University of North Carolina. You start seeing in Ohio University and Miami University, University of Cincinnati start to form and prosper during this time period. Miami University was formed in 1809. I think Ohio University was formed in 1803. So the early stages of the 1800s, they start to prosper during the 1830s and 40s because they start getting some tax money. Ohio, of course, is growing at that point. It has become a state by that point. So, because our population is growing, you start seeing more and more people going to the universities, and they're going for a multitude of different things. They're going in for medicine, for law, for theology. And then in some places, Ohio State starts as an agricultural school that we're going to teach you higher level farming techniques and machinery that goes along with it. So all of these different state-run schools are going to provide a higher level of liberal education than what the lower levels can offer. And then, of course, the second part of that is women are going to start looking to go to school as well. This was not considered something, Harvard didn't have a female class back then. So you start seeing female schools start to form. You start seeing Vassar and Holyoke and some of these other universities forming that are traditionally women's colleges and specifically for women's. You start seeing libraries, which were the ideas and the idea of Ben Franklin, who formed the first library in the United States back in the 1700s in Pennsylvania. You start seeing libraries become a more entrenched institution, especially at universities, obviously, but even communities start to realize it'd be a good idea to have a repository of books so that people who want to learn about something can find the resources that they need without having to spend an arm and a leg. You start seeing traveling lectures. These were called lyceums. When we talk about Abraham Lincoln, you're going to read one of his traveling lectures that he gave called the Lyceum Address now, but it literally was a group of people that would meet to hear a lecture over a specific topic and then basically discuss it. In Europe, they called them salons. Here, we called them lyceums. And then you start seeing magazines over a whole host of different topics, whether they be political, whether they be religious, whether they be over the home and the family life and whatever else. All of that was happening during this time period where they're starting to produce different articles, collections of articles every month, showing that, again, not only is America literate, but higher level literate, that we're one of the most literate societies in the world, even back then. In fact, our country is more literate than England at that point. So, here, the greatest nation in the world, the empire that everybody aspires to be, still can't read at the same level that the Americans can. You also, because of the Second Great Awakening, appealing to the emotion, appealing to the goodness in people, they start to ask questions about prisons and about criminal codes. Are we really doing the right things by prisoners? And this is where you start to get the debate for the first time of what are the purpose of prisons in a society. It used to be just lock them up, throw away the key. That was kind of the mentality across the board. Now they're going to start asking questions of, is a prison supposed to be there to reform? Are you supposed to be trying to teach these people how to be proper members of society and, forgiving them over time? So you start seeing prisons get this argument over that, and by extension, insane asylums. What is the purpose of an insane asylum? To put somebody in there into a padded room and just kind of lock them up and, allow them to kind of just live out their days in their own sickness? Or are you trying to show some humanity towards them and try and understand the problem and research it and find ways to maybe deal with it and cope with it to where they can rejoin society and rejoin their families? One of the main proponents of this is Dorothea Dix, who's pictured here. She is one of the main proponents of a more human approach towards both mental health and the prison system. She is well beyond her years when it comes to this. She is well ahead of her time. This doesn't really become a mainstream thing until the late 1800s, early 1900s. She's doing it in the 1830s and 40s. So a very forward-thinking woman and a very hard-headed woman who's going to be an inspiration to the women's rights movement, of whether it be for the absence of alcohol or temperance as it's known, whether it be for women's suffrage, which is voting, whether it be for equal pay, whatever the case may be. Dorothea Dix is going to be somebody that people point to and say, she's one of the pioneers. She's one of the ones that really kind of went out there and showed that women have the power to make change and to establish themselves within American society. Okay. Now, demon rum is a nice way of putting alcohol, a not so nice way of putting alcohol. This was a time period where women started to notice that men had issues with alcohol. And a lot of those issues would kind of grow into financial disparity. They would grow into violent tendencies, broken homes. The problems of drinking are not just that guys would go and get drunk. It's that they would spend all of their earnings and then the family suffer. It would be that the men would come home from the bar drunk and beat their wives, that the men would, hurt their children in some way, shape, or form, or that the marriage would fall apart because the guy loved the drink more than he did his family and his wife. So the problems of drinking are certainly out there. And there were a large group of women that said if we could just take care of the drinking, if we get rid of alcohol, a lot of these other problems would go away. And so they started to form what are known as temperance society. Now, temperance and teetotalism are completely different things, even though they are moving towards the same goal. Temperance is the idea that we're going to get rid of alcohol, for the most part. We're going to allow a little alcohol here and there. So somebody that is a temperate person would say, you're allowed alcohol in certain instances. So, if your church service requires, if you have communion where you have to have wine, that's an exemption. If you're getting married and you're celebrating and you want to have a toast, that's an exception. Somebody graduates from university and again, you want to have a toast and you want to celebrate, that's an exception. So temperance doesn't mean that you can't have alcohol completely. It just means that you're going to limit the amount of it. Teetotalism is we're done with it entirely. These women pictured here, the lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. It's one of my favorite photos because these women are not exactly, worried too much about how the picture makes them look, so to speak. But this is a tough photograph because they're trying to look tough, obviously, and this is a time period where the shutter speed was awful slow and whatever else. So these poor women really have some awkward poses, to say the least. But the message is clear: they are teetotalers. They don't believe that alcohol should be part of the American life at all. So they're going to be pushing for what eventually becomes known as prohibition, but that doesn't happen until the 19-teens. So these women are, again, ahead of their time, okay? And they do manage to get some temperance laws on the books. In Maine, they get one in 1851. So some states, some regions are going to be what are known as dry, meaning they don't allow alcohol to be sold, made, or consumed in their counties. There are still counties out there that do. I went to a wedding a few years ago out in Pennsylvania where just outside of Pittsburgh, where my friend's family, who was getting married, it kind of took me by surprise that they lived in a dry county. And the reason is I was used to them having a beer every now and then. Anytime I had met up with them, they usually had alcohol with dinner or something like that. So when I showed up to the wedding, I was surprised to see that the wedding couldn't have alcohol at all. And I said, wow, that's really strange. And they're like, yeah, we love going to Ohio because we can go to a local restaurant and order a beer. We can't do that at home. So again, there's still some dry counties out there. It depends on where you live, depends on the morals and the religious beliefs and all that of the local community, but they do exist. And they are products of this time period and this feeling. Now, of course, that's going to have major impacts on women. Okay, women are going to get more involved. Like Dorothea Dix is going to get involved in the prison and insane asylum reform movements. Women are going to get involved in the temperance movement. Women are going to get involved in the abolition movement, trying to get rid of slavery. So the rights of duties and duties of women are going to start changing during this time period. And the ideas about women in the 19th century are different than the ideas of women in the 18th century. So whereas Abigail Adams was considered, considered a kind of forward-thinking woman, she was still the wife of John Adams. She was still the person that raised John Quincy Adams. She was a mother. There was no, she's a mother and a social reformer. Now you can be both. You can be a mother, you can be a wife and a mother, but you're also going to be involved in society and your voice is going to be heard. And you start seeing female reform movements gaining momentum throughout the 1830s and 40s. And I'm not going to go through all the leaders here, but you have people that are going to be pushing for major reforms. The major names that you'll see time and time again are Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. We'll come back to Susan B. Anthony when we talk about the suffragette movement, and for that matter, Stanton as well. But you're talking about this list as being a pretty solid list of what eventually becomes known as the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, where they call together women and they produce a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which sounds very similar to the Declaration of Independence. And it's basically a statement of Declaration of Independence for women. that they are not going to stand by and allow men to just run society, that women are going to get involved. And they're going to start pushing for a number of different changes, but the major one is suffrage. They want the right to vote. Now, of course, the Seneca Falls Convention happens in 1848. There are men present. One of the major ones is a guy named Frederick Douglass, who will come up in our discussions about abolition and all that. But Frederick Douglass is there, as well as some other men as well. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband is also there and very supportive of this. But the men don't really have a right to vote at this convention. They are kind of on the periphery. It is a female-run convention, and they produce their document on their own because they want to make sure people understand how important their voice is. This has far-reaching implications, but it's a long road. Keep in mind, that happens in 1848. And it's not until 1920 that women get the right to vote. So this is a long process. Now, these women also have other achievements as well. One of the main ones is Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, who is the first woman to graduate from a medical school and become a certified doctor. So again, you have some major strides for women during this time period, but you also have other roadblocks in their quest for equality in the United States. You also have during this time period a push for utopias. Utopias are perfect societies, these societies where everybody gets along and everything's perfect. And so you have communistic communities. This is basically would be Karl Marx's dream. This is kind of where his ideas germinate from, is attempts like this to have perfect communities where everybody works for the betterment of everybody else. It's communal living at its finest. And you can see, Harmony, Brook Farm, Oneida, all these. I'm not going to get into the basics of this because the AP test loves these things, and I don't know why. I don't think you're going to have an essay over this. And usually you have maybe one or two or maybe even three multiple choice questions. Usually those multiple choice questions are very common sense. It's these communities where everybody's supposed to kind of get along and everybody's supposed to work for the betterment of each other. And, there's really no, wages. Everybody kind of just takes care of each other. And of course they fail. And why do they fail? Because of human greed, because of laziness, because, it's again, you're only as strong as your weakest link, and they have weak links. Okay. You have other communities like the Shakers who basically believe that you don't have relationships, you don't have children. So how in the world do you continue your community if you don't have a next generation? You constantly have to depend on recruiting other people from the outside to come in and not have children. So these things are all going to fail because, to have a perfect community, you have to have perfect people. And we know that doesn't exist. So, they attempt this and God love them, they try. And there are still communities out there that try to do this, but you're destined for failure. We know that from experience. Because if you look up anything about Harmony, Brook Farm, Oneida, and the Shakers, you will find that they were a strong community for about 5, maybe 10 years, and then they fail completely. So bottom line is that's the social reformers. Now, tomorrow we're going to talk about not just sectionalism, but we're going to talk about the factors that cause the rift between the North and the South. If you have any questions over any of the stuff I talked about today, please reach out. Otherwise, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll talk to you soon.